68 years old, and Ruth Calloway stood at the edge of a life she no longer recognized as her own, holding a thin envelope of cash that amounted to nothing more than $9.40. Her late husband's nephew, a calculating young man named Victor Calloway who had inherited the family's modest estate through a will Ruth had never been shown in full, had informed her with cold civility that the house she had lived in for 31 years was now his to sell, and that she would need to find lodging elsewhere before the month's end. She did not fight him in the courts, for she had no money for lawyers and no family left to stand behind her. So she took her small savings, a cedar box of her late husband's letters, and her mother's wedding ring sewn into the hem of her coat, and she walked to the edge of the town of Ashford Mill, Pennsylvania, in the gray hush of a 1901 autumn, where she found a crumbling stone gristmill abandoned along Cutter's Creek, its will rotted and still. She paid $6 for it, the whole of what remained to her name, and the men at the land office exchanged a look of pity as they handed her the deed, certain she had bought nothing but a ruin. She did not know, standing in the mill's cold shadow with the key trembling in her hand, that behind the great stone millstone at its center waited a ledger sealed away for nearly 40 years, one that would restore not only her own dignity but the fortunes of an entire town that had long ago given up hope of ever being made whole. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ruth Calloway. If you have ever been told that what you have left is worthless, we hope this story reminds you that worth is not always visible to those who are looking for a reason to dismiss you. Tell us in the comments if you've ever found strength in something everyone else had already given up on. Ruth had been born Ruth Hartley in 1833, in a farming township outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the eldest of 5 children raised by a father who ground wheat for half the county and a mother who kept the household ledgers with a precision that bordered on reverence. Elijah Hartley ran a modest gristmill on the banks of a slow creek, and it was there, among the groaning wheel and the dust-heavy air thick with the smell of cracked grain, that Ruth spent the whole of her girlhood learning a trade that few women of her time were ever permitted to touch. Her father, unconventional in ways that scandalized the more proper families of the township, insisted that his daughters understand the mechanics of milling as thoroughly as his sons did, for he believed, as he often told them while adjusting the tension of the great stone wheels, that knowledge was the one inheritance no fire, flood, or dishonest relative could ever take from a person. Ruth absorbed this lesson so deeply that by the age of 12 she could diagnose a misaligned millstone by the sound of its grinding alone, and by 14 she understood the delicate art of dressing a stone's grooves so that it would yield the finest flour in the region. Her mother, Constance Hartley, taught her something equally vital, though less easily named: the discipline of record-keeping. Constance had grown up the daughter of a shopkeeper who had lost his business not through any fault of craftsmanship, but through carelessness with his accounts, and she carried the lesson forward with an almost religious devotion. Every transaction at the Hartley mill was recorded in leather-bound ledgers, every debt owed and debt forgiven noted in Constance's tight, exacting hand, and she taught Ruth that a ledger was not merely a record of money but a record of a community's trust in itself, a document that, kept honestly, could outlast any single person's memory or any single person's lies. Ruth would sit at her mother's side on winter evenings, copying columns of figures by lamplight, and though she did not yet know it, she was being prepared for a moment decades in the future when this exact skill would matter more than she could then imagine. The Hartley Mill was not merely a business but a kind of quiet institution in the township, the place where farmers of every station, wealthy landowners and struggling tenant farmers alike, brought their grain to be ground, and where, in years of poor harvest, Elijah Hartley was known to extend credit to families who could not pay, trusting them to settle their debts when fortune turned kinder. This was, Ruth came to understand, the deepest value her father held, that a mill did not simply serve those who could afford its services, but bound a community together through mutual reliance, through the slow accumulation of small kindnesses extended and eventually repaid. It was a philosophy that shaped everything Ruth would later become, though she could not have guessed, as a girl covered in flour dust and grinning at her father's approval, how directly her own life would come to depend upon that same philosophy being honored by others when she herself had nothing left to offer. Ruth met Thomas Calloway in 1854, when she was 21, at a county fair where he had come to inspect a new design of millstone he hoped to import for his own family's operation near Ashford Mill. Thomas was a serious, soft-spoken man of great integrity, a miller by trade like her own father, and their courtship was built not on romance in the conventional sense but on a shared understanding of craft and labor that Ruth had rarely found in other suitors, most of whom regarded her knowledge of milling as an oddity rather than a virtue. They married in 1855 and settled in Ashford Mill, where Thomas operated the very gristmill that would, decades later, become the ruin Ruth was forced to purchase for $6 desperate. In those early years, the mill thrived under their joint stewardship, Thomas managing the physical labor and correspondence with grain merchants while Ruth, drawing on the training her mother had given her, kept the books with the same scrupulous honesty Constance Hartley had modeled for her. Ashford Mill in those decades was a modest but proud township, its fortunes tied directly to the success of Thomas and Ruth's gristmill, for it was the only mill within a full day's wagon ride, and farmers from as far as the Susquehanna Valley brought their harvests there to be ground. Ruth became, over the years, something of a quiet fixture of the town's economic life, known and trusted by farmers who came to rely not only on the quality of the milling but on the fairness of the accounting, for Thomas and Ruth continued the practice Ruth's father had modeled, extending credit in lean years and never once, in Ruth's recollection, calling in a debt from a family that could not bear the burden of repayment. They had one son, Samuel, born in 1858, a bright and gentle boy who showed early promise as a scholar rather than a miller, and though Thomas had once hoped his son would inherit the mill, he came instead to take a quiet pride in Samuel's ambitions toward the law, sending him to study in Philadelphia in 1876 with what savings the mill's modest but steady profits allowed. It was, in Ruth's memory, the happiest decade of her life, marked by hard work, mutual respect, and the particular contentment of a family whose fortunes were modest but secure. That security began to erode in 1879, when Thomas's younger brother, Josiah Calloway, a man of considerable charm but little discipline, arrived in Ashford Mill deeply indebted from a failed venture in the coal trade further west. Thomas, ever loyal to family in the manner Ruth had come to both admire and quietly distrust, agreed to take Josiah into partnership at the mill, believing his brother's talk of modernizing the operation with new milling technology from Ohio. Ruth harbored reservations from the outset, for she had seen in Josiah's ledgers, which he insisted on maintaining separately from her own once he joined the business, an evasiveness about specific figures that reminded her uncomfortably of the shopkeeper whose carelessness had ruined her own grandfather decades before. But she held her tongue, trusting her husband's judgment of his own brother, a decision she would come, in later years, to regard as the single costliest silence of her life. Thomas died suddenly in the winter of 1885, of a seizure of the heart while inspecting the mill's water wheel during a hard freeze, and Ruth's grief was compounded almost immediately by the discovery that Josiah, in the 6 years of his partnership, had quietly accumulated debts against the mill's name that Ruth had never been shown, borrowing against future harvests and mortgaging equipment to creditors as far away as Harrisburg, all while presenting Ruth and the town with an appearance of prosperity that was, in truth, built upon obligations he had no genuine means of repaying. Samuel, then a young lawyer newly established in Philadelphia, urged his mother to pursue legal action against his uncle, but Ruth, still raw with grief and unwilling to fracture what remained of Thomas's family, allowed Josiah to buy out her interest in the mill for a sum that seemed, at the time, more than fair. Not yet understanding the full extent of the debts, she was thereby releasing him from having to answer to her about directly. It was a decision born of grief and trust rather than foolishness, but it left Ruth without ownership of the mill that had defined her entire adult life, and she spent the following 15 years in a small rented cottage on the edge of town, living modestly on the proceeds of that sale and on occasional bookkeeping work for local merchants who valued her old reputation for honesty. Samuel, tragically, died of influenza in 1897, leaving Ruth without immediate family, and it was in this diminished state, a widow of 64 with no children living and a dwindling nest egg, that she found herself entirely dependent upon the charity of Thomas's extended family when her savings finally ran out in the winter of 1901. That charity came in the person of Victor Calloway, Josiah's son and Thomas's nephew, a man Ruth had watched grow from an ambitious boy into a coldly calculating merchant who had, over the years, acquired much of his father's old property, including, unbeknownst to Ruth until his father's death in 1899, the very gristmill Thomas had once owned outright. Victor had allowed Ruth to occupy a small room above his own dry goods store in the years after her savings failed, an arrangement he made much of publicly as an act of family generosity, Though Ruth came to understand, in the humiliating particulars of daily life under his roof, that he regarded her presence as an inconvenience he tolerated for the sake of appearances rather than affection. When a wealthier tenant expressed interest in the room Ruth occupied in the autumn of 1901, Victor informed her, with the same cold civility Thomas had never possessed, that she would need to vacate within the month, that family charity, as he put it, could not be expected to last forever. Ruth did not argue, for she had learned across 68 years that argument rarely moved men who had already decided a matter in their own favor. She took the small sum she had managed to preserve, $9.40, along with a cedar box containing Thomas's old letters and her mother's wedding ring, sewn for safekeeping into the hem of her traveling coat, and she left Victor's store with as much dignity as a woman in her circumstance could summon. It was while walking the length of Ashford Mills Main Street, uncertain of where she might find lodging with so little money, that she came upon the old gristmill itself, the one Thomas had built his life around, the one Josiah's debts had ultimately claimed and which had stood empty and crumbling for the better part of a decade, its water wheel rotted through, its stone walls choked with ivy, its roof sagging under the weight of untended years. She learned from the clerk at the county land office, a kindly if bemused young man named Franklin Ott, that the mill had been seized by the county years before for unpaid taxes Josiah's estate had never settled, and that it had sat unsold since, too dilapidated for most buyers to consider worth the asking price, which the county was eager to be rid of for a mere $6. Franklin Ott made no effort to hide his surprise when Ruth produced the exact sum from her small purse and asked to complete the purchase that same afternoon, remarking, not unkindly, that most folks considered the old Callaway mill more trouble than it was worth, a pile of rotted timber good for little but firewood. Ruth said only that she had once known the mill rather well, and that she believed it still had use left in it, a statement Franklin took for the sentimental delusion of an old widow with nowhere else to go, though he processed the deed transfer without further comment and handed her the heavy iron key that had once, decades before, hung on a hook beside her own kitchen door. Ruth walked the half-mile to the mill alone, her cedar box tucked beneath one arm, and stood for a long while at its threshold before she found the courage to enter, for the building held within its walls the whole of a life that had once been happy and had since been stolen from her by degrees, first by her brother-in-law's dishonesty and now, decades later, by his son's cold indifference. The interior, when she finally forced the swollen door open, was thick with the smell of dust and old grain long since gone to rot, and shafts of gray afternoon light fell through gaps in the roof to illuminate a scene of profound neglect, cobwebbed machinery, a broken hopper, and at the center of the main floor, still standing exactly where Thomas had positioned it 30 years before, the great stone millstone itself, too heavy and too integral to the building's structure for anyone to have bothered removing it during the years of the mill's slow abandonment. Ruth spent that first night in the mill wrapped in her coat on a bed of relatively clean straw she found in what had once been the grain storage loft, too proud to seek shelter elsewhere and, if she admitted it to herself, unwilling to leave the building now that she had finally returned to it. It was the following morning, running her hand along the millstone's edge out of an old habit born of 40 years spent assessing the soundness of milling equipment, that she noticed something which would have escaped the attention of anyone without her particular training. The stone's runner, the upper wheel that would once have rotated against the fixed bedstone below it, sat slightly askew upon its spindle, tilted in a manner that suggested it had at some point been deliberately lifted and repositioned rather than simply worn or shifted by decades of disuse. It took Ruth the better part of 2 days, working alone with tools she found rusting in a corner of the mill and a strength she had not called upon in years, to lever the great runner stone from its resting position, and when it finally shifted, grinding against the bedstone with a groan that seemed to echo the whole of the mill's long silence, she found, in the shallow recess beneath where the stone had sat, a leather-bound ledger wrapped in oilcloth that had kept it remarkably dry across what she would soon learn had been nearly 2 decades of concealment. Her hands trembled as she lifted it free, for she recognized, even before she opened its cover, the particular style of binding her own husband had favored for the mill's account books, and when she did open it, she found Thomas's own handwriting filling its pages, dated across the final years of his life, the very years of Josiah's partnership that Ruth had always suspected but never been able to prove had been built upon deception. The ledger was, Ruth understood within the first hour of reading it by the gray light filtering through the mill's broken roof, nothing less than the true accounting Thomas had secretly kept of his brother's dealings, a shadow record maintained separately from the public books Josiah controlled, in which Thomas had documented, with the same scrupulous honesty Ruth's own mother had taught her decades before, every debt Josiah had incurred against the mill's name, every farmer's account Josiah had quietly falsified to hide losses, and most significantly, a running list of nearly 30 local families whose genuine, honest debts to the mill Josiah had claimed as settled in the public books while secretly continuing to collect payment from them under threat of foreclosure on their own small farms, pocketing the difference for himself across years of quiet extortion that Thomas, in his final entries, had clearly begun to suspect but had not lived long enough to fully expose. Tucked into the ledger's back pages, Ruth found a letter in Thomas's hand, addressed to her, dated only weeks before his death, in which he confessed his growing certainty that Josiah was defrauding not merely the mill's finances but the very farmers whose trust had built Ashford Mill's prosperity across 2 generations, and his intention, once he had gathered sufficient proof, to expose his brother's conduct to the town's council regardless of the family shame it would bring. He had hidden the ledger beneath the millstone, he wrote, because it was the one place in the mill Josiah had never once shown interest in, regarding the physical machinery as beneath his attention compared to the figures he manipulated on paper, and Thomas had intended to retrieve it once his proof was complete, an intention his sudden death had left tragically unfulfilled. He asked, in the letter's final lines, that whoever found this record deal with it not for vengeance against his brother's memory, but for the sake of the families Josiah had wronged, families who deserved to know the truth of debts they may have continued paying long after those debts were rightfully settled. Ruth wept over that letter for the better part of an afternoon, grieving anew not only for Thomas but for the 15 years she had spent believing her husband's brother merely careless rather than deliberately cruel, and for the farmers of Ashford Mill who had, according to the ledger's careful accounting, continued paying Josiah and then Victor sums they did not truly owe, sums that had, across 2 decades, quietly enriched the Calloway family while impoverishing the very community that had once trusted them completely. She understood, reading through the ledger's meticulous entries a second and third time, that this was not merely old history but an active wrong, for several of the debts Thomas had documented as fraudulently extended appeared, based on dates and amounts, to still be under collection by Victor himself, who had inherited not only his father's property but, it seemed, his father's willingness to profit from deception. She did not act immediately, for she understood, as her mother had once taught her about ledgers and their power, that such a document was only as strong as the corroborating proof and credible witnesses that could be assembled around it. She spent the following weeks quietly restoring the mill's most basic functions with what little money she could earn from mending and bookkeeping work in town, insulating her small living quarters against the coming winter with materials the sympathetic Franklin ought extended her on credit once he began to suspect, from her careful questions about old county tax records, that the widow Calloway was pursuing something more substantial than mere nostalgia. In the evenings, by lamplight, Ruth cross-referenced Thomas's shadow ledger against the public account books Victor still kept at his dry goods store, records she was able to access under the pretense of settling her own small debts there, and she began to construct a complete and devastating picture of exactly how much money the Calloway family had extracted from the town's farmers across 20 years of deception that began with Josiah and had continued, evidently, under Victor's own management of the family's remaining interests. Word travels quickly in a small town, and it was not long before Victor Calloway learned that his aunt by marriage, rather than fading into the quiet poverty he had assumed awaited her, was spending her days at the ruined mill and asking pointed questions of the farmers who still, out of old habit and diminishing hope, brought small payments to his store each month against debts they believed they still owed the Calloway family. Victor arrived at the mill on a cold December afternoon, ostensibly to inquire whether Ruth intended to actually attempt milling grain in a building he clearly regarded as beyond any practical use, though the unease beneath his condescension was evident to Ruth in the too careful way. He avoided asking directly what she had been discussing with Franklin Ott and with several of the farming families around the township. Ruth, meeting her nephew's eyes with a calm she had not felt in years, told him plainly that she had found Thomas's private ledger beneath the millstone, and that she believed a number of Ashford Mill's families were owed a considerable accounting regarding debts long since settled but apparently still being collected. Victor's composure, she noted with something approaching grim satisfaction, did not crumble so much as harden into a colder, more calculating stillness, the expression of a man rapidly assessing how much exposure he actually faced. He attempted, over the following weeks, a range of responses calibrated to Ruth's apparent vulnerability. He suggested, with feigned concern, that her memory and judgment might not be entirely reliable given her age and recent hardships. He spread quiet word among certain townsfolk that the widow Calloway had grown eccentric in her isolation at the old mill and was inventing grievances against a family that had, after all, sheltered her. And when these efforts failed to produce any retreat on Ruth's part, he offered, through an intermediary, to forgive whatever remained of her own small debts at his store if she would simply abandon her inquiries and leave the mill's history undisturbed. Ruth declined every overture with the same unhurried dignity, and continued instead doing precisely what Victor had not anticipated from a woman he considered thoroughly diminished by circumstance. She began quietly and systematically compiling statements from the farming families named in Thomas's ledger, most of whom, once shown the specific dates and figures Thomas had documented, recognized immediately that they had indeed continued paying debts for years after those debts should rightfully have been considered settled, payments that had, in several cases, cost struggling families sums that meant the difference between comfortable subsistence and genuine hardship. She brought this compiled evidence, along with Thomas's original ledger, to the township's council, presenting her case not to a single judge or officer but to the collective body of townsmen who had known both Thomas and Ruth across decades of honest dealing, reasoning that a wrong done to an entire community deserved to be addressed by that community, rather than resolved quietly behind closed doors in a manner that might allow Victor to simply relocate his schemes elsewhere. The council meeting that followed, held in the modest township hall on a bitter January evening in 1902, was unlike anything Ashford Mill had witnessed in a generation, for it drew nearly every farming family named in Thomas's ledger, along with council members who had themselves, in some cases, unknowingly continued paying phantom debts to the Calloway family across the years. Ruth presented her evidence with the same methodical clarity her mother had instilled in her decades before, reading aloud from Thomas's careful accounting and comparing it, figure by figure, against the testimonies she had gathered, while Victor, seated uncomfortably at the chamber's edge, first attempted denial, then minimization, and finally, faced with the accumulated weight of dates, figures, and the unmistakable authenticity of his own uncle's handwriting cross-referenced against his own store's ledgers, offered a grudging admission that discrepancies existed which he claimed, without much conviction, he had inherited unknowingly from his father's mismanagement rather than perpetuated himself. The council's resolution, guided by the town's elderly magistrate, Judge Aldrich Beaumont, who had known Thomas Calloway personally and had no patience remaining for his nephew's evasions once the figures were laid plain before him, was thorough though notably merciful in the manner Thomas's own letter had requested. Victor was compelled to forgive, immediately and in full view of the assembled town, every outstanding debt improperly carried forward from Josiah's original fraud, a forgiveness that freed nearly 30 families from obligations that had, in several cases, hung over them for the better part of 2 decades. Further, recognizing that actual restitution was owed for years of improperly collected payments, the council arranged for Victor to surrender the deed to his remaining commercial properties in Ashford Mill, including the profitable dry goods store, the proceeds of which were placed into a township fund earmarked specifically for the farming families who had suffered the greatest documented losses under his and his father's schemes. Victor Calloway left Ashford Mill within the season. His standing in the community he had once dominated through inherited wealth utterly dissolved, though the town's collective mercy, echoing Thomas's own wishes, spared him the criminal prosecution that a less forgiving community might have pursued. Ruth did not seek to reclaim the mill's old commercial prominence for herself alone, though she certainly could have, given her sudden and unexpected restoration to a position of respect within the township. Instead, she used a portion of the settlement funds, with the council's blessing, to begin restoring the gristmill itself, not as her private property alone, but as a cooperative venture in which the very farming families Thomas's ledger had named as wronged were invited to hold shares proportional to what they had lost, a structure Ruth designed drawing on the very ledger-keeping principles her mother had taught her 60 years before, ensuring that the mill's restored prosperity would be distributed as honestly as her father had always insisted a community mill's fortunes ought to be shared. Within 2 years, the mill was grinding grain again, its restored water wheel turning steadily against Cutter's Creek, its books kept with the same scrupulous transparency that had once made the Hartley and Callaway Mills the trusted centers of their respective communities, and Ruth, in her 70s now, found herself once more exactly where she had begun her adult life, standing beside a millstone, ensuring that a community's trust in itself remained honestly and faithfully recorded. We began this story with a 68-year-old widow standing before a ruined mill with $6 in her purse and nothing left to her name, cast aside by a nephew who counted her as a burden too old and too diminished to matter any longer. It is worth returning now to that image, because it holds within it the whole of what Ruth Callaway's life had prepared her to understand and what she, in turn, restored to Ashford Mill. She had been raised by a father who believed knowledge could never be stolen from a person, and by a mother who taught her that a ledger, honestly kept, was a record of a community's faith in itself. Victor Callaway believed that Ruth's advanced age and reduced circumstances made her irrelevant, a woman whose only remaining value lay in whatever small charity he chose to extend her. But Ruth had spent 7 decades learning that worth is rarely visible on the surface of things, not in a crumbling mill building, not in an old woman others had already dismissed, and not in a stone ledger sealed away beneath a millstone for 20 patient years. The gristmill did not make Ruth Callaway valuable. It simply gave the town of Ashford Mill, at long last, the chance to recognize what had been true of her all along, and to finally settle accounts that honesty alone had kept sealed until she came to claim them. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight and for walking alongside Ruth through the whole of her story. If her patience and quiet resolve moved you, we hope you'll share this with someone who might need reminding that being counted out by others is never the same as being without worth. Before you go, we would love to know, what is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off as finished? We read every story you leave for us in the comments, and each one reminds us why we tell these stories in the first place. Until next time, stay close.